"What are you waiting for? Write any amount on this check and it's yours," laughed the billionaire. But when the beggar did this, his face went white. The arrogant billionaire mocked the terrified homeless man, waving a blank check in the air like it was a toy. The elite around him laughed cruelly, anticipating the spectacle of public humiliation. But when that man in rags picked up the pen, the impossible happened. His hands were trembling, not from nervousness, but from recognition, as if that piece of paper awakened buried memories. And then every movement became surgical. Every number written with precision that would leave Goldman Sachs executives impressed. The billionaire's smile froze. The mockery turned to panic, because in that moment he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. That beggar knew banking secrets that could destroy empires. And what happened next changed everything forever. I am the billionaire butler, 40 years serving the most powerful people in the world. I've witnessed secrets that move trillions, conversations that decide the fate of nations, moments where fortunes are born and die. And this story revealed the most shocking truth I've ever witnessed about what really separates the rich from the poor. Are you ready to discover it? The Pemberton mansion gleamed like a jewel against Manhattan's dark sky. Every window radiated golden light, revealing elegant silhouettes dancing among imported crystals and marble. It was the annual charity gala of the Pemberton Foundation, an event where New York's wealthiest gathered to display generosity while discreetly competing over who had more zeros in their bank accounts. I circulated among the guests with silver trays, my steps silent on the Italian marble floor. 40 years serving the elite had taught me the art of elegant invisibility, being present without being noticed, listening without being perceived, observing without being seen. That night, however, there was something different in the air, a tension that hung between the forced smiles and superficial conversations about financial markets and corporate acquisitions. Marcus Pemberton, the host, was known for his cruelty disguised as heir to a banking fortune built over 5 generations. He had transformed arrogance into refined art. Tall, at 6 feet 2 inches, with perfectly groomed grey hair styled by a private barber who flew from London every week just to tend to his appearance, he wore an Armani tuxedo that cost $45,000, more than most families' cars. His shoes were Beluti, specially commissioned and handmade by artisans who took 3 months to complete the pair. The watch on his wrist was a Patek Philippe Grand Complication, valued at $2.5 million. His tie was woven with real gold threads and cost $15,000. Pemberton owned 17 residences around the world, including a palace in Monaco, a castle in Scotland, a villa in Tuscany, and a 200-meter yacht permanently anchored in Saint-Tropez. His art collection included 3 Picassos, 5 Monets, and a Van Gogh he had purchased for $68 million at a private auction. But all this material wealth hadn't bought the one thing he truly desired: genuine respect. Instead, he had cultivated fear, envy, and forced adulation. People smiled to his face while whispering about his cruelty behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the main hall, interrupting conversations. The hall itself was an architectural masterpiece, with a hand-painted ceiling by Italian artists, a 5-meter-tall bohemian crystal chandelier weighing 2 tons, and authentic 18th-century Persian rugs. The guests turned toward him, champagne glasses suspended in air. I recognized that tone in his voice, the same one I had heard hundreds of times over the years. Pemberton was preparing one of his cruel games, spectacles that humiliated the less fortunate for the entertainment of the powerful. "As you know," he continued, walking slowly through the center of the room, "our tradition includes a little entertainment." Among the guests was Victoria Ashworth, widow of the oil magnate, wearing a necklace of black Tahitian pearls worth $3 million. Beside her, Charles Whitmore, president of First National Bank, smoked a Cohiba Bahaik cigar that cost $2,000 each. There was also Richard Sterling, owner of a luxury hotel chain, who possessed properties on every continent and whose personal wealth exceeded $8 billion. His wife, Elena, wore a 15-carat pink diamond ring that had belonged to French royalty. Senator James Morrison was present, known for his close ties to major corporations and his ability to influence legislation that benefited the ultra-wealthy. He was chatting animatedly with Margaret Bloomberg, heiress to a media empire, who controlled 3 television networks and 15 newspapers around the world. Today, Pemberton continued, his voice taking on that performative tone I knew well, I decided to do something special. A test of financial knowledge that could change a life. Deal. Through the French windows of the hall, which offered a panoramic view of Central Park, I could see a figure slowly approaching the main entrance. His steps were cautious, his posture bent by the weight of some invisible pain that went far beyond the physical. The man wore clothes that had once been of good quality, but were now worn by time and weather. His coat was wool, probably Brooks Brothers, but with stains that told stories of nights sleeping on park benches and hurried meals in shelters. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, as the night was mild, but from that deep fatigue that only prolonged poverty can imprint on the human soul. His eyes, however, were different, clear, intelligent, with that quality I had learned to recognize in great business leaders. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the top of the world and knew intimately its darkest secrets. Ah, Pemberton smiled upon noticing the figure in the window. It seems our special guest has arrived. The private security guards, dressed in discreet but expensive suits, escorted the man inside. The difference was stark. While the guests wore jewelry worth fortunes, he carried only a small, worn, synthetic leather backpack and a look that mixed preserved dignity with growing desperation. The contrast was intentional. Pemberton had orchestrated this scene with theatrical precision. The beggar represented everything the rich secretly feared, the possibility of losing everything, of falling from grace, of discovering that their wealth was more fragile than they imagined. "Allow me to introduce Edward Harrison," Pemberton announced with poorly disguised disdain, each word dripping with venom. "Former resident of this area, now, let's say, in significantly reduced circumstances." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like waves on a tranquil lake. Some guests whispered among themselves behind ivory fans and crystal glasses. Others simply watched with that morbid curiosity that the very wealthy develop when confronted with poverty. A mixture of fascination and revulsion. I continued serving, moving with the fluidity of decades of experience, but my attention was completely focused on the scene unfolding before my eyes. There was something about Edward Harrison that didn't fit with the narrative Pemberton was constructing. First, his posture. Despite the worn clothes and humiliating situation, he stood erect. His shoulders weren't curved by defeat. There was an intrinsic dignity in his bearing that contrasted with his external appearance. Second, his eyes. They didn't show the submission that Pemberton clearly expected. Instead, there was an almost meditative calm, as if Edward were evaluating the situation with the same analytical precision an executive would use to examine a business proposal. Third, his hands. Although calloused by years of hard work, they had carefully trimmed nails and a shape that suggested years handling important documents, signing contracts, operating sophisticated financial calculators. Edward Harrison didn't seem intimidated by the surrounding opulence. His familiarity with the environment was evident in how his eyes catalogued details, the approximate value of the paintings on the walls, the quality of the Persian rugs, the provenance of the floor marble. It was the gaze of someone who had once inhabited this world. "Mr. Harrison here," Pemberton continued, his voice taking on that paternalistic tone the wealthy use when they want to appear benevolent, "has an urgent need. Isn't that right, Edward?" Edward nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a refined education that starkly contrasted with his current appearance. "My daughter needs surgery. Stage 3 cancer. The doctors at Sloan Kettering say we have less than a week to gather the necessary resources for the procedure. An uncomfortable silence filled the hall. The mention of illness and death disturbed the atmosphere of superficial celebration that these people carefully cultivated. They paid fortunes to isolate themselves from the reality of human hardships, and the raw presence of suffering in their golden sanctuary deeply unsettled them. Cancer didn't respect bank accounts. Death wasn't impressed by investment portfolios, and this fundamental truth terrified them more than any stock market crash. How tragic, Pemberton feigned compassion, his voice distilling sympathy as false as his electoral promises. Well, since we are generous people here, I decided to offer a unique opportunity. He made a dramatic pause, savoring everyone's attention. He was a master of theatrical manipulation, knowing exactly when to pause for maximum emotional impact. Pemberton withdrew from his tuxedo's inner pocket a checkbook from Chase Private Bank, the most exclusive bank on the East Coast, reserved only for clients with liquid assets exceeding $50 million. The paper had a special quality, a texture indicating authenticity and exclusivity, invisible watermarks, security fibers, holographic codes. Each check was worth more in security than many cars. This, he brandished the checkbook in the air like a magician displaying his final trick, is a blank check from my personal account at Chase Private Bank. Edward, if you can fill it out correctly, and when I say correctly, I mean every banking procedure, every security protocol, every technical detail that a check of this magnitude and importance requires, the money is yours. The guests laughed. Some applauded with that refined cruelty that characterizes the social elite. Humiliation disguised as generosity was an art they had perfected over generations. It wasn't enough to simply possess wealth. It was necessary to use that wealth to demonstrate superiority over those less fortunate. The cruelty of the challenge was evident to anyone who understood finance. Private bank checks didn't work like common checks. They had elaborate security protocols, mandatory fields that needed to be filled with technical precision, verification codes that only financial sector professionals knew. It was like asking a beggar to perform brain surgery or pilot a commercial jet. Technically possible, but practically impossible without years of specialized training. Of course, Pemberton continued, his smile becoming crueler with each word, like a blade being sharpened. If you make any mistake, any comma out of place, any incorrect procedure, any poorly filled field, you not only lose the opportunity, but will also be escorted by security and permanently banned from returning to this neighborhood. The final threat was unnecessary, but Pemberton couldn't resist. It wasn't enough to humiliate Edward. He needed to ensure he understood completely his inferior position in the social hierarchy. Edward looked at the check, then at the expectant faces around him. 50 pairs of eyes watched him like spectators in a Roman Colosseum, eager for gladiatorial blood. I could see calculations being made in his mind, probabilities being assessed, risks being weighed against desperate need. But then, something changed in his expression. The hands that trembled from fatigue and malnutrition stabilized. His shoulders straightened imperceptibly. There was a strange calm taking hold of him, as if buried memories were resurfacing, as if intellectual muscles atrophied from disuse were being reactivated. "What amount can I write?" he asked, his voice firmer than before, carrying an authority he hadn't demonstrated until that moment. Pemberton laughed loudly, a sound that echoed through the hall like the roar of a predator spotting its prey. "Oh, be ambitious. How about $250,000? More than enough for your daughter's surgery, don't you think?" The amount provoked impressed murmurs even among that wealthy audience. $250,000 represented more money than most people see in a lifetime. For Edward, it represented not just his daughter's life, but the difference between hope and absolute despair. For the guests, however, it was an amount they spent casually on weekend vacations or designer handbags. The disproportion was intentional, high enough to be tempting, but not high enough to significantly impact Pemberton's fortune. "And if I accept this challenge," Edward said calmly, each word measured with surgical precision. "Will you honor the check before all these distinguished witnesses?" Pemberton replied, gesturing theatrically to the guests. "My word of honor as a Pemberton." In that moment, something fundamental changed in the hall's atmosphere. Edward Harrison straightened completely, and for the first time that night smiled. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It wasn't the expression of someone begging for mercy or hoping for charity. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The smile of a professional gambler who had just received exactly the cards he was hoping for. The smile of someone who recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. "I accept," he said simply, but that single word carried decades of knowledge, experience, and determination. The atmosphere in the hall changed instantly. What had begun as a humiliation spectacle was transforming into something completely different. The guests approached, forming a tighter circle, as if instinctively knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Pemberton, still confident in his superiority, approached a massive mahogany table that had been specially prepared for the occasion. The table itself was an antique manufactured in 18th century England, with ivory inlays and gold details. On it, he carefully arranged limited edition Mont Blanc pens, auxiliary documents, and an Italian leather blotter. While the final preparations were being made, I took advantage of the distraction to observe Edward more closely. 40 years serving the elite had taught me to recognize details that others ignored, and there were details about Edward Harrison that didn't make sense for a man in his apparent situation. First, his shoes. Although worn and clearly used for a long time, they were genuine Italian leather, Gucci or Ferragamo, judging by the construction and style. Such shoes cost at least $2,000 when new, and even after years of use, they maintained a quality that cheap shoes never possessed. Second, his watch. Almost hidden under his shirt's worn cuff, I could glimpse what appeared to be an Omega Seamaster. It wasn't the most expensive model in the line, but still represented several $1,000s of investment. Why would a man in desperate circumstances not have sold such a valuable watch? Third, his body language. Edward observed the room with the eyes of someone making professional assessments. I noticed him discreetly cataloguing the paintings on the walls, estimating values, recognizing artists. His attention briefly paused on the security system, cameras, sensors, access points, with the analytical gaze of someone familiar with high-level protection systems. Fourth, his manner of speaking. Despite the humiliating situation, Edward hadn't used slang, informal contractions, or any form of language indicating limited education. His diction was precise, his vocabulary sophisticated, his syntax impeccable. "Do you know who he really is?" a voice whispered behind me. It was Victoria Ashworth, widow of the oil magnate, one of the most perceptive clients I had served over the years. She had noticed my focused attention on Edward and approached discreetly. "No, ma'am," I replied quietly while refilling her glass with Dom Perignon. Victoria looked around cautiously, making sure no one else was listening to our conversation. "Edward Harrison," she murmured, each word loaded with meaning. "I met him 15 years ago when my late husband was negotiating the acquisition of a technology company. Edward was senior vice president at Goldman Sachs, specializing in international mergers and acquisitions." My blood ran cold. Goldman Sachs, one of the most prestigious and exclusive investment banks in the world. If Edward Harrison had held a senior position there, he knew banking systems, financial protocols, and security procedures better than anyone in that room, including Pemberton himself. "But what happened to him?" I asked, keeping my voice low and professional. Victoria sighed, a sound laden with genuine sadness. "A terrible story. Really, he discovered a complex money laundering scheme involving some of the bank's biggest clients, billionaires, politicians, even some heads of state. When he tried to report it through appropriate channels, he was systematically framed for the very scheme he had discovered. The pieces began fitting together like a macabre puzzle. The familiarity with luxury environments, the confident posture despite circumstances, the evident knowledge of financial protocols, the way he had accepted Pemberton's challenge. The real culprits had powerful connections, Victoria continued, her voice almost a whisper. Politicians, judges, media executives, they orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy Edward's reputation. He lost his job, his house in the Hamptons, his savings, even his friends. No one wanted to associate with someone accused of financial crimes. The injustice was staggering. An upright man had tried to do the right thing and was destroyed by the very corrupt system he tried to expose. He spent the last 10 years trying to clear his name, Victoria continued, her eyes following Edward as he approached the table prepared by Pemberton. But when you're blacklisted by Wall Street, when your reputation is poisoned by financial media, there's no way back. He worked in lesser jobs, far below his qualifications, never managed to re-establish himself professionally. And now his daughter is sick, I completed, fully understanding the desperation that had brought Edward there. Sarah, Victoria confirmed, a brilliant girl, graduated from Harvard Medical School. Ironically, she's an oncologist herself, but cancer doesn't discriminate. And without the premium health insurance Edward used to have, treatment costs are astronomical. While we conversed discreetly, Edward was already seated at the table prepared by Pemberton. The guests had formed a circle around them, like spectators in a modern coliseum, eager for the humiliation spectacle they anticipated. But there was something different in the atmosphere now. Perhaps it was the growing confidence in Edward's posture, or perhaps some of the more perceptive guests were beginning to suspect there was more to this story than Pemberton had revealed. Pemberton placed the blank check before Edward with exaggerated ceremony, like a magician revealing his most impressive trick. "Remember?" he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, each word emphasized for maximum dramatic effect. "This is a check from Chase Private Bank, not a common commercial bank check. It has specific security protocols, mandatory verification codes, complex authentication procedures that, if not followed exactly according to federal regulations and internal banking policies, completely invalidate the document." Edward picked up one of the offered Montblanc pens, a limited edition Meisterstück Solitaire that cost $8,000. The irony wasn't lost. The pen was probably worth more than any item currently in his possession. He examined the pen for a moment with the attention of a surgeon examining his scalpel. He tested the ink on the paper's corner, checked the writing flow, adjusted the grip in his hand. These were the precise movements of someone who had signed thousands of important documents, someone who understood that small details can have enormous consequences. Then Edward looked at Pemberton, and in that moment, the power dynamic in the room began to shift subtly. "Before I begin," he said calmly, his voice assuming an authority that had been dormant for years, "I'd like to confirm some technical details that are essential for the validity of this type of transaction." Pemberton frowned, clearly not expecting technical questions. His confidence had been based on the assumption that Edward would be ignorant about sophisticated banking procedures. "What kind of details?" he asked, a note of irritation beginning to appear in his voice. "The routing code for Chase Private Bank's Manhattan branch is 02212021, correct?" Edward asked casually, as if commenting on the weather. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Most of those present, despite their wealth, didn't know specific banking codes by heart. They had accountants and financial assistants to handle those details. Pemberton hesitated visibly, clearly not expecting Edward to know banking codes from memory. "Well, yes, I believe that's correct," he stammered, his confidence beginning to waver. "And for checks above $50,000, Edward continued methodically, it's necessary to include dual verification notation in the memo field, in addition to the standard signature. We also need the special authorization code for high-value transactions, which must be entered in the reserved field on the back of the check." "Adi," now Pemberton was visibly uncomfortable, sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the room's controlled temperature. Some guests began whispering among themselves, realizing that something was fundamentally wrong with their expectations about how this evening would unfold. "I'll also need to confirm," Edward proceeded with the precision of a lawyer building a case, "whether your account has pre-approved limits for withdrawals of this magnitude, or if we'll need to include a special authorization code from the account manager." How do you know all this?" Pemberton exploded, his carefully constructed composure crumbling before everyone's eyes. Edward smiled for the second time that night, and this time his smile carried decades of knowledge and experience that had been hidden under years of adversity. "Mr. Pemberton," he said softly, but with an authority that silenced the entire room, "before my life took a different turn, I was responsible for training senior banking executives in high-value protocols at Goldman Sachs. For 8 years, I taught courses on security procedures for transactions above $100,000 to the largest investment banks in New York, London, and Tokyo. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the palpable presence of collective shock. I could see panic growing in Pemberton's eyes as he realized he had gravely underestimated his entertainment. "Furthermore," Edward continued, taking advantage of the moment, "I supervised due diligence for mergers and acquisitions totaling over $40 billion. I worked directly with central bank treasuries, sovereign funds, and family offices of ultra-high net worth individuals." Each word was like a hammer breaking the narrative Pemberton had constructed. The ignorant beggar was revealing himself as someone with financial credentials superior to most of those present. "This is impossible," someone murmured in the crowd. "It's an elaborate hoax," said another, but the conviction in their voice was lacking. But Edward was already writing, and his transformation was impressive to observe. His hand moved with surgical precision over the paper, filling each field with the expertise of someone who had done this not just thousands of times, but who had taught others how to do it correctly. The amount, $250,000, written first numerically with perfect clarity, 250,000 dues, then written out without a single hesitation, $250,000 and 0 cents. But he didn't stop there. Edward included verification codes that most of the guests didn't even know existed. In the memo field, he added the notation HV Auth Conf, indicating authorization for high-value transaction with confirmation required. Alphanumeric codes that only financial sector professionals would know. His signature followed specific authentication protocols, not just a simple signature, but a complex sequence that included initials, date, and personal verification codes that private banks require for substantial transactions. When he finished, Edward placed the Montblanc pen delicately beside the check and leaned back in his chair, his transformation complete. The man who had entered the room as a humiliated beggar had revealed himself as a financial expert whose competence exceeded that of most present. "Done," he said simply, but that word carried the weight of decades of experience and knowledge that had remained dormant for years. Pemberton approached trembling, his hands visibly unstable as he picked up the check. His eyes scanned each line, each number, each notation, desperately searching for an error. Any microscopic flaw he could use to nullify the agreement and save his disintegrating reputation. But there was none. Absolutely none. The check wasn't just correct, it was filled out with a level of technical precision and sophistication that exceeded what many senior banking executives could produce under pressure. Every security procedure had been followed meticulously. Every code was in the correct place. Every protocol had been respected with professional expertise. "Well?" Edward asked calmly, his voice carrying an authority that had been forged in Wall Street boardrooms. "Is it technically correct according to Chase private bank standards?" Pemberton opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water. Each second of silence increased his humiliation before all his social elite peers. The power reversal was palpable. The man who had orchestrated this humiliation now found himself being publicly exposed. "I need to verify some technical details," Pemberton stammered, clearly stalling for time while his mind worked frantically to find an exit. "What specific details?" Edward asked patiently. "I can explain any procedure that isn't clear." Edward's offer to educate Pemberton about banking procedures in front of all of New York's elite was the final humiliation. Murmurs began rippling through the crowd, no longer in anticipation of Edward's downfall, but of growing embarrassment at their host's behavior. "Perhaps," an authoritative voice cut through the tension, "I can help with the verification." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Charles Whitmore, president of First National Bank and one of the most respected bankers on the East Coast. His word on financial matters was considered gospel, even among that wealthy audience. Whitmore approached the table with the dignity of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms, where billion-dollar decisions were made daily. He took the check from Pemberton's trembling hands and examined it with the expertise of 40 years in the banking sector. "Impressive," he murmured after a few moments, his voice carrying genuine professional approval. "Not only correct, but executed with a level of sophistication I rarely see even among our own senior executives." He looked at Edward with new respect, professional recognition shining in his eyes. "You've included verification protocols that many banks don't even require anymore. This check not only meets Chase Private Bank standards, but significantly exceeds minimum requirements." Pemberton visibly paled. Having another prestigious banker publicly contradict him was a social disaster of epic proportions. "Charles, I appreciate your opinion," Pemberton began desperately, "but surely there are other factors to consider." "There are no additional factors," Whitmore interrupted firmly, his voice carrying the authority of decades building and managing fortunes. "The check is perfect. Mr. Harrison clearly possesses technical expertise superior to most professionals working at my institution." Whitmore's public endorsement was devastating for Pemberton. Among those present, Charles Whitmore's word on financial matters was law. If he declared the check valid, no amount of objection from Pemberton could contradict that assessment. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, turning to face Pemberton directly, "you made a public bet, Marcus. The gentleman fulfilled his part of the agreement with exemplary competence. Now you need to honor yours." The net was closing around Pemberton. Not only had Edward exceeded all technical expectations, but now he had the backing of the most respected banker present. The financial elite was beginning to question not Edward's competence, but Pemberton's integrity. But men accustomed to absolute power don't surrender easily, and Pemberton was far from finished with his sabotage attempts. "Even assuming the check is technically correct," he said quickly, his mind working to find any loophole, "there are still substantial legal and regulatory issues to consider." Edward maintained his calm expression, but I could sense growing tension in his shoulders. Each obstacle Pemberton created was another barrier between him and the money that could save his daughter's life. "What legal issues?" Edward asked, his voice steady but wary. "This check represents a substantial financial transaction," Pemberton explained, regaining some of his confidence by finding new territory to maneuver. "Federal law requires any transfer above $200,000 to be reported to tax authorities and requires complete documentation of the beneficiary's current financial situation." It was an insidious half-truth. While regulations about large transfers did exist, they wouldn't prevent immediate processing of the check. Pemberton was deliberately complicating the process, hoping to discourage Edward. "And there's also," he continued, looking disdainfully at Edward's worn clothes, "the matter of your current residential situation. People without fixed addresses frequently face significant difficulties processing large-value banking transactions due to money laundering regulations." The guests began murmuring again, but this time with less conviction. Some were beginning to realize that Pemberton was moving the goalposts repeatedly, changing the rules every time Edward exceeded his expectations. Edward remained calm, but the fatigue of years fighting systematic injustices was visible in his eyes. "Is where I'm currently living relevant to the technical validity of the check?" he asked. "Unfortunately, yes," Pemberton lied smoothly. "Banks have very specific policies about transactions involving people in unstable housing situations. It's a matter of due diligence and regulatory compliance." "Actually," Charles Whitmore interrupted again, his voice carrying growing irritation, "that's completely incorrect, Marcus." All eyes turned to the respected banker, who was visibly displeased with Pemberton's tactics. "There is no legal or regulatory impediment to processing this check based on Mr. Harrison's residential situation," Whitmore declared categorically. "As long as he has adequate identification and the check is filled out correctly, which it clearly is, the transaction is valid under all federal and state regulations." Pemberton's face turned ashen. Being contradicted once by Whitmore had been embarrassing. Being publicly contradicted twice was complete social humiliation. "Charles, surely you understand the complexities." "I understand," Whitmore cut him off, his patience clearly exhausted, "that you're deliberately creating unnecessary obstacles to avoid honoring an agreement you yourself proposed. This not only violates the terms of your own bet, but reflects extremely poorly on your personal character." The direct attack on Pemberton's character in front of all of New York's social elite was equivalent to a social death sentence. Among these people, reputation was currency, and Whitmore had just declared Pemberton bankrupt. "The check is valid, Marcus," Whitmore continued relentlessly. "Technical expertise has been demonstrated beyond any doubt. There are no legal impediments. You need to process this transaction immediately, or your word is worthless." The social pressure was immense. Dozens of pairs of eyes watched Pemberton, waiting for his response. His reputation, built over decades, was being shredded before the very foundational members of New York's elite. But even cornered, Pemberton made one last desperate attempt. "Very well," he said, forcing a smile that didn't come close to reaching his eyes. "Assuming all technical and legal issues are resolved, there's still a fundamental practical matter." Edward waited, knowing another sabotage was coming. "I cannot process a check of this magnitude at this hour of night," Pemberton declared, clinging to this last thread of hope. "Banks are closed. Electronic transfer systems don't operate after business hours for non-pre-authorized transactions." It was technically true, the traditional banks closed, but Pemberton was deliberately ignoring the emergency banking systems that existed for situations exactly like this. Edward, however, smiled for the third time that night. And this time, his smile carried the confidence of someone who had anticipated exactly this objection. "Mr. Pemberton," he said softly, "you're correct that traditional commercial banks close, but you forgot something important about Chase Private Bank." He reached into his weathered backpack and retrieved a small electronic device that I recognized, a mobile payment terminal connected to high-security banking systems. Chase Private Bank offers 24-hour transaction processing for medical emergency situations involving premium clients or their authorized transactions, Edward explained calmly. This device is connected directly to the central banking system and can process transactions up to $500,000 with appropriate biometric authorization. Pemberton stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. "You can't have access to that kind of system," he said weakly. "My daughter has been admitted to Sloan Kettering since the day before yesterday," Edward explained patiently. "The hospital provided me with this device specifically to process any payment necessary for her emergency treatment. It's fully authorized and connected to the federal banking system." The final net was closing. Pemberton had no more exits, no more technical, legal, or practical excuses he could invent. Every escape route had been methodically blocked. Edward positioned the check under the device's camera. The screen showed a crystal-clear image of the document, each field filled with technical perfection, visible even through the small screen. "Processing transaction" appeared on the screen, followed by a series of security codes and automatic verifications. The silence in the room was deafening. 50 people collectively held their breath, all eyes fixed on the small screen that would determine not just the destiny of a life, but the social standing of two men whose fates had become intertwined on this extraordinary night. Seconds that felt like hours passed. Verification codes scrolled across the screen. Biometric confirmations were processed. Security protocols were satisfied one by one. Then, in bright green letters, "Transaction approved, $250,000. Euro successfully transferred to designated medical account." Edward closed his eyes, and for the first time that entire night, allowed himself to show genuine emotion. Tears ran down his face, not tears of humiliation or despair, but tears of relief, of hope, of gratitude for a miracle that almost didn't happen. "Thank you," he whispered, looking at Pemberton with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, perhaps forgiveness for a man who had tried to destroy him for entertainment. But Pemberton wasn't looking at Edward. He was staring at the faces of the guests around them, faces that reflected a mixture of admiration for Edward and barely concealed contempt for his own cruelty. The humiliation he had planned for Edward had turned against him with devastating force. The entertainment he had orchestrated to demonstrate his superiority had instead revealed his fundamental character flaws to everyone who mattered in his social circle. Victoria Ashworth was the first to approach Edward, her face showing genuine respect and compassion. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "I knew your reputation from before everything happened. What they did to you was criminal. But tonight, you showed everyone here what true dignity looks like." Other guests began approaching, offering congratulations, business cards, invitations to private meetings. Word was spreading rapidly through the crowd, not just about Edward's technical expertise, but about his grace under pressure, his dignity in the face of humiliation, and his moral character in a situation designed to break him. Charles Whitmore was among those who approached. "Edward," he said, extending his hand, "I'd like to speak with you privately before you leave tonight. I believe I may have a position that would interest you." Within minutes, Edward went from being an object of pity to being the most sought-after person in the room. His transformation was complete, not just from poverty to temporary wealth, but from social pariah to respected professional. Meanwhile, Pemberton stood alone, watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The guests who had applauded his cruelty minutes earlier now avoided eye contact. The social dynamics that had once revolved around his wealth and influence were shifting dramatically. Margaret Bloomberg, a media heiress with connections throughout New York's elite circles, approached Pemberton with an expression of barely contained disgust. "Marcus," she said coldly, "what happened here tonight will be discussed in every social circle that matters. Your reputation—" She didn't need to finish. They both knew that his social standing had been irreparably damaged. Among the ultra-wealthy, stories like this spread with lightning speed, and his behavior tonight would be remembered and repeated for years to come. As the evening wound down, Edward said his goodbyes to the new contacts he had made. Several business cards were exchanged, multiple lunch meetings were scheduled, and at least 3 job offers were extended on the spot. Before leaving, he approached Pemberton one final time. "Mr. Pemberton," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I hold no grudges. Tonight you gave me something invaluable, not just the money for my daughter's treatment, but the opportunity to remember who I really am." Pemberton looked at him with a mixture of shame and confusion. "How can you, after what I tried to do to you?" Because," Edward replied with the wisdom that comes from surviving adversity, "true wealth isn't measured by what you can take from others, but by what you can give when you have nothing left to give." With that, Edward walked out into the New York night, carrying with him not just the money that would save his daughter's life, but a renewed sense of purpose and dignity that no amount of suffering had been able to destroy. Behind him in the opulent mansion, Pemberton stood among the ruins of his social reputation, finally understanding that his greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating Edward's technical skills, but his fundamental character. The days that followed that extraordinary night transformed the lives of both men dramatically, but in completely opposite directions. Edward Harrison rushed to Sloan Kettering, where Sarah was being kept in intensive care. The surgery was scheduled immediately, performed by a team of the best oncologists on the East Coast. During the 18 hours the procedure took, Edward sat in the waiting room, still wearing the same worn clothes from the previous night, but now carrying himself with a dignity that transcended material circumstances. During Sarah's recovery period, Edward's phone began ringing constantly. Word about the incident at the Pemberton mansion had spread through New York's financial circles with viral intensity, not just about his technical expertise, but about his character, his resilience, and his grace under extreme pressure. Charles Whitmore was the first to make a formal offer. "Edward," he said during a private lunch at the Carlyle, "I need someone with your experience and character to head our new ethics and compliance division. What happened last night showed me exactly the type of person I want leading my organization." The salary offer was substantial, not just enough to cover Sarah's ongoing medical needs, but sufficient to restore Edward to financial stability. More importantly, it was a position that would allow him to use his expertise to prevent other people from suffering the same injustice he had endured. Other offers followed rapidly. Investment banks that had previously blacklisted him now competed for his services. His reputation, which had been destroyed by lies and manipulation, was being rebuilt on the solid foundation of truth and demonstrated competence. Within 2 weeks, Edward had accepted Whitmore's offer and begun working to establish new standards for ethical conduct in financial services. He never forgot the months of poverty and desperation, never became arrogant about his restored position, never lost his empathy for those struggling against systemic injustice. He established a scholarship fund for children of families facing medical crises, implemented whistleblower protection programs at multiple financial institutions, and became a voice for reform within an industry that had once destroyed him. Sarah's recovery was complete and miraculous. The early intervention made possible by that night's events saved not just her life, but preserved her career as an oncologist. She returned to her work with renewed passion, specializing in treating patients who couldn't afford premium medical care. Father and daughter bought a modest but comfortable house near the hospital, close enough for Sarah to continue her treatments while resuming her medical practice. Edward never flaunted his new fortune, never forgot the pain of those months when hope seemed impossible. Marcus Pemberton, meanwhile, discovered that arrogance has a very high price in the world of social elite. The story of his cruelty at the party spread rapidly through New York's high society circles. Not the version he tried to promote about being deceived by an imposter, but the true version, corroborated by dozens of respected witnesses who had been present. Victoria Ashworth, who had connections throughout the entire social elite network, made certain that everyone knew exactly how Pemberton had tried to humiliate a desperate man seeking money to save his dying daughter's life, how he had changed the rules repeatedly, attempted multiple sabotages, and refused to accept defeat with dignity. The true character of a person, she said during an interview for the New York Social Register, is revealed not in the way they treat their equals, but in the way they treat those they consider inferior. Social invitations began disappearing. Charity associations cancelled partnerships with the Pemberton Foundation. Boards of directors for multiple companies where he held positions began questioning his suitability to represent their brands. More devastatingly, his own family began distancing themselves. His wife, Catherine, who had tolerated years of arrogant behavior, finally had public evidence of the type of man she had married. "I'm ashamed," she said during the divorce proceedings she initiated 3 months after the party. "Not just for what you did to that man, but for what it revealed about who you really are beneath all the wealth and social positioning." Pemberton's social empire crumbled like a house of cards. Friendships built over decades of social reciprocity evaporated when he became a reputational liability. His own employees began treating him with cold professionalism rather than previous deference. The final irony arrived 6 months later when Pemberton found himself needing a substantial bank loan to cover losses from declining investments and mounting divorce settlements. The bank he approached was First National Bank, and the executive designated to review his application was Edward Harrison. Sitting across from him at the polished mahogany desk, Edward studied Pemberton's financial documents with the same meticulousness he had used to fill out the check on that fateful night. "Mr. Pemberton," Edward said calmly, "I see several significant problems with your application." Pemberton, who had lost considerable weight in the previous months, looked smaller, less imposing than before. His arrogance had been replaced by palpable anxiety. "What types of problems?" he asked, his voice lacking its previous authority. "Well," Edward responded professionally, "your liquidity ratios are below our standard parameters. There are also serious questions about the sustainability of your current revenue streams, considering the recent losses in investments and increased personal expenses due to divorce proceedings." It was the same technical language that Pemberton had mocked months earlier when used by someone he considered inferior. "And there's a significant question of character," Edward added gently. Pemberton's head snapped up. "Character? Our bank takes very seriously the integrity of our clients. We have strict policies about doing business with individuals whose ethical conduct is in question due to documented incidents of cruelty or abuse of power." The silence that followed was laden with meaning. Both men knew exactly what Edward was referencing. "However," Edward continued, "I believe in the possibility of redemption. If you are willing to participate in our community responsibility program, including volunteer work with low-income families facing medical crises, we might reconsider your application." It was an offer of grace that Pemberton didn't deserve, but that Edward offered nonetheless. Not from weakness, but from strength. Not from naivety, but from wisdom that comes from surviving injustice and choosing compassion over revenge. Pemberton looked at Edward for a long moment, perhaps seeing for the first time the man he had tried to humiliate, a man whose character had remained intact through poverty, illness, and despair, a man who now offered a second chance even after being treated with deliberate cruelty. "I accept," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. As I observed this transformation unfold over the months, I felt a deep satisfaction in witnessing what we call, in our more discreet circles, cosmic justice. During my 40 years serving the elite, I learned that there are two types of wealth: that which is built on solid foundations of character, knowledge, and integrity, and that which is merely accumulated through inheritance, luck, or manipulation. The first type resists life's storms and frequently grows stronger through adversity. The second type crumbles at the slightest sign of genuine pressure. Edward Harrison possessed the first type. Marcus Pemberton possessed only the second. On that September night, when I saw a man in rags fill out a check with more precision than any executive in the room, I understood something fundamental about the nature of true wealth. Knowledge cannot be stolen, experience cannot be faked, character cannot be bought. Edward had lost his house, his social position, his savings. But he never lost his expertise, his integrity, or his dignity. These were riches that no amount of corporate sabotage could destroy. Pemberton, on the other hand, had inherited money, position, and power. But he had never developed the wisdom, humility, or compassion that transformed privilege into true nobility. When crisis came, Edward stood firm because he was built upon rock. Pemberton crumbled because he was built upon sand. There's a profound lesson here for all of us, regardless of our current position in life. True security doesn't come from how much money we have in the bank, but from who we are when everything else is stripped away. I have seen billionaires cry like children when their financial castles crumbled because they had never developed anything beyond their ability to accumulate money. And I have seen people who lost everything rise stronger than before because they possessed internal riches that no one could touch. Education is one of those riches. Technical skills are another. Moral integrity is perhaps the most valuable of all. Edward Harrison taught me that a man can be wearing rags and still be richer than anyone in the room. Not because he possesses hidden money, but because he possesses something much more valuable: knowledge applied with wisdom, experience tempered by adversity, and character tested by suffering. And Marcus Pemberton taught me that all the wealth in the world cannot buy the only thing that truly matters in the end: genuine respect from fellow human beings. That night, when the check was processed and $250,000 were transferred, it wasn't just money that changed hands. It was power, it was dignity, it was justice, and it was a lesson I will carry forever. Never underestimate someone based on their external appearance, because you never know what kind of wealth they carry within. True wealth isn't in the value of the check you can fill out, but in the knowledge, character, and wisdom you carry, even when the whole world bets against you. That is the lesson of the billionaire butler, and that is a story you should never have heard, but needed to know. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever been underestimated, or know someone whose true value was ignored by society, share in the comments. Your experiences inspire others to never give up on revealing their true inner wealth. Subscribe to The Billionaire Butler for more revelations from behind the scenes of the elite, where we'll discover that the greatest lessons about wealth come from the most unexpected moments. Because sometimes the most powerful stories happen when we think no one is watching, but the butler is always watching, and there are always more secrets to reveal.